Welcome to Work This Way, a labor and employment podcast. I'm Tina Emerson, Chief Marketing Officer at Maynard Nexsen, and I'm joined today by Keely Fresh. She is a Maynard Nexsen attorney here in Greenville. Good to see you.
Hey, Tina. Good to see you.
Well, today we are coming to you from Greenville SHRM's 2024 HR and Leadership Conference, where local HR and employment professionals are gathered for insightful sessions with expert speakers. With us today is Carrie Cavanaugh, a senior HR consultant for Find Great People. It is a nationally recognized talent acquisition and human resources consulting firm. Carrie is here at GSHRM to speak on building effective compensation programs and to host a panel of attorneys that will discuss legal issues involving compensation. Carrie, thanks so much for being here with us today.
Thank you for having me. It's good to be here.
It is great to have you. Can you start us off by explaining why all employers should have compensation plans with a clear set of guidelines?
Oh, sure. Well, I had a mentor once who told me, if you don't know where you're going, any road will take you there. And the challenge becomes for employers, if we don't have a strategy, then we just make spur of the moment decisions that can lead to real problems later with issues of equity and inclusion and diversity, and lots of legal issues happen. So it's essential that we create a plan and stick to it, because we also have a budget to consider. And often, if we just leave it up to everybody's whim to make decisions, we come up with something that's way out of our budget, way out of our sight line, and doesn't fall within our mission and vision and values. So we've got to have something in place that keeps everybody moving and rowing in the same direction.
Right. That makes a lot of sense, talking about guidelines and trying to fit within a budget. Can you tell me some of the best practices that you've seen in real life regarding compensation plans that have helped businesses not only retain employees, but also attract top talent?
Sure. Well, I think one of the first things, and it's not super complicated, is we have to know what the job is worth in order to create a strategy. And I think some employers do a great job of benchmarking data and using that data to make real life decisions, but a lot of organizations don't. And so I think what creates a plan first and foremost is understanding what the job requires and then getting realistic data that says what this job is worth, so that we can then be transparent with our employees about how they can move through the process to eventually make more money. But I also think part of a compensation plan is understanding what our employees value and what we as an organization value. There's a value to remote work. There's a value to time off. There's a value to retirement planning. And organizations that may elect to pay a little lower in cash compensation may be offering a great offset when it comes to perhaps retirement planning. I have a client right now that may not pay the highest in the market, but they make a 10% contribution to someone's 401k plan. We need to understand what that is, document it, and then we can explain it to our employees. So in my perspective, the best thing somebody can do is really understand the job, understand the market, and then be able to make some decisions.
That makes a lot of sense. Kind of switching gears, you talked about that there are a lot of legal issues surrounding compensation.
And that's why we love Maynard Nexsen.
And we love working with you. So you know this, the Department of Labor recently issued a final rule expanding overtime eligibility by increasing the salary threshold requirements for exempt employees. Everyone's been talking about it. It's been a big issue.
Big issue.
So how do you anticipate that this is going to create decisions for employers, for both existing employees and new hires? Like, what did we need to be looking at? What decisions are going to be needed to make?
That's great. We're asking our attorneys those same questions. But I think one of the things to consider when you're talking about compensation strategy, if we're looking at the bottom line dollar, I'm a big believer that exempt or non-exempt doesn't really change what I pay somebody. It just changes how I pay them. And so I think the big decisions that my clients are wrestling with is looking at that threshold and saying, do we have exempt people under this threshold? And if we do, if we look at the market, is the value of the job enough to warrant this new number? Or do we need to change its classification? And then we have to do the analysis to say, what is it going to cost us to change it? So we have to consider overtime. Are they working a lot of overtime? And if so, what is the value of that job then? But my first thought to my clients is, don't panic. That's the first thing, right? You don't have to change what you pay somebody. You just may have to change how they're classified. And so that's a big decision. And I think it's driven off what we said in the beginning, which is that essential part of a plan, which is understanding the value of a job. Tell my clients, don't rush to move it up $10,000 before we know if the job's worth $10,000 more. Otherwise, we put a great communication plan in place for employees to explain why they're now going to be classified differently. And it's at that point, it's just communication. But it needs to be good communication, because some people push back a little bit and they feel something's being taken away when their exemption status changes. But we can work through that, as opposed to just making a rash decision to change somebody's pay just because we've got a new number here now.
And I was going to follow up on that question about classification. What kind of challenges are you seeing when an employer is looking to discern how they want their employees to be classified and how it benefits them, how it benefits the employee?
Oh, sure. Well, everybody wants their employees to be exempt, right? I mean, that's easy. So, I mean, it's easier, it's cheaper because you don't pay for overtime, but it's easier because you're not having people clock in and out. You're not having to manage overtime, and you're not dealing with people that might be what we call overtime thieves. You know, they clock in a few minutes early and a few minutes late, and it ends up being 2.5 hours of overtime. So, you know, I think that from a challenge perspective, they all want them to be exempt. And I think what I find and what we find in the consulting world is we have to go in and really help them assess whether or not they meet those qualifications. And, you know, honestly, when the threshold goes up, we get to have more of those conversations, because people call us and they're like, oh my gosh, I'm not going to pay $50,000 for this job. And I'm like, well, you know, they shouldn't have been exempt at all. So maybe we can actually make that change now. So, you know, for me, it's that it's easier to be exempt, that there's less expense, there's less hassle. And sometimes I have some kind of what I would call more old school clients whose people don't want to punch a time clock. Even though most of them are on computers now, they still don't want to track their time. And that's a mental hurdle we have to help people get past. I think it's getting better. I find it more with more very tenured employees that don't want to do that. But as far as I see the challenges for employers, you know, we just have to convince them to do the right thing. And in this case, a number this high is going to really push them to jump there. But as we saw before, it got injuncted before, if that's the right term. And so I'm telling my clients, don't do anything yet. But let's assess. Let's look at who's under the number, where they are relative to everybody else. What's that value of that job? And you know, do we feel that the job is worth that big jump? And if it's not, then what's our plan to change them to a non-exempt or, you know, salaried non-exempt kind of role?
Right. And talking again about the DOL rule, if that new rule survives legal challenges, the exempt salary threshold will increase about $23,000.
Oh, it's insane.
Between now and January.
Yes, it's crazy.
So do you think this change is going to help or hurt businesses that are trying to recruit employees who kind of fall in that $35,000 to $58,000 range?
I think it's a great question, but I really do think we can still argue that how you advertise a job and what the value of that job is stays the same. So if it's a $45,000 job and now it's going to be hourly or non-exempt, I think it's more just, I don't think it hurts so much from a recruiting perspective. I think it's going to be a challenge for some people who have always viewed themselves as exempt or were exempt at their old job. Now they come into a new job and they're going to have to punch a time clock. But I don't think that's a hurdle we can't get over, but I think it's something that we talk about early in those interview stages where we say this is a non-exempt job. And it also does pose some challenges if we've got people working remotely, if we issue company cell phones, those kind of things. You know, if we're working off the clock, we can't do that anymore for someone who's a non-exempt or hourly employee. And so we have to put rules and guidelines into place within the organization that prohibit after hours work, which is an adjustment for some organizations because they're very used to having people on call 24/7, and now we're going to have to rein that back in. So I think there's as much it's going to be, I don't know that we're going to have a recruiting issue as much as we're going to have a communication and educational component on the management and leadership side that we're not going to be able to call on these people. Or if we do, we're going to have to pay them.
Right. This is definitely a good time for businesses that might be reluctant to change to really take the time to assess what they need to do Do you have any suggestions or expectations for long-term planning issues that might arise due to the salary progressions for jobs in this pay range?
Well, that's a great question. And, I think we're looking at it, I think maybe like attorneys are looking at it. Let's look at it in phases. So, we have this first phase in July if it goes unchallenged. What I'm telling my clients right now is we need to look at that census, that employee census. We need to identify who's exempt, who's non-exempt. With our exempt people, we need to see who's under the threshold. And then we need to do that analysis. What's this job worth in the market? Are we underpaying these people now, or are they right on target? If we're underpaying them, then do we want to raise it? And do we want to raise it enough to meet the new threshold? If we do, then great, everybody wins. But if we don't, then we need to make some other plans. And then the question becomes, if we do that for the July number, then we have to do it again for the January number. So we're really looking at saying, where does that fall? Are we willing to make that ultimate bump, or are we willing just to make this first bump? And I think we have to talk through that. And then we have to look at equity issues, because if we have 5 people in the same role and 2 of them are already over the threshold and 3 are not, and we're going to bump the 3 up, what are we going to do with the other 2? So these 3 people got a raise and these 2 didn't, and we can have some equity issues because there might have been realistic reasons and documented reasons that these other 2 are already making more money. And we want to honor that. So we may end up moving 5 people up instead of 3. And so we need to do that analysis now to look at it from a cost perspective. And then we have to look at the job and say, can this job really be non-exempt? I mean, how much work are they doing at night? How much work are we asking them to do on the weekend? How many phone calls are they taking? And if they're going to be exempt or non-exempt and they're doing all that stuff, then we've got to realign that job description and pass that off to somebody else, which means somebody else is getting more work, which means their job might be worth a little more. So we have to take all of that into consideration, but we need to look at it now. Because ultimately, I mean, I don't have a crystal ball, and I don't think our attorneys do either. And I think a lot of people believe that this number may not end up at 58, but it's going to go up. I think what most people believe. And so we need to go on and be having this analysis. And I tell my clients, you need to be looking at this all the time anyways. What's the job worth? And, are our people paid fairly relative to what we believe is a good compensation philosophy?
Great. Well, thank you for your input, Carrie.
Oh, well, thank you for having me.
And also for letting us take you away from the conference that is outside. You probably can hear the bustling outside these doors.
It's break, so everybody's visiting all the exhibitors and getting all the free stuff.
Yeah, well, thanks for taking the time. We're glad to have you here.
Good
Appreciate your insight. We love working with fine, great people. Thank you for being a valued client of Maynard Nexsen.
Well, we are always proud to support Maynard Nexsen in any way we can. The attorneys have helped me and my clients on more occasions than I can count, and I am grateful for that dream team that I can call and ask a question. And so.
Fantastic. Well, thanks for being here.
Thank you.
We will see you next time on Work This Way.